Hi, and welcome to a Small Medium at Large podcast, bringing you stories that heal. We are very happy to have a new guest here today and welcome her with open arms. I find that we have met through two different places. One was from our dear friend Stanley Krippner, and another was being a guest on a group that meets through the IONS network. And after hearing and speaking with her on that, I wanted to have her on the show, and I'm really happy to have her here. So we actually got to meet once, but other friends have also tried to connect us. Also, she comes on the next show right after we had Mark Ireland with his show, and it turns out they both actually live near each other. So this is all just a cosmic coincidence, but I have to say it's pretty funny because I felt like her show really is the right one to follow on his. So let me introduce her and tell you about Georgena Eggleston Grace. Georgena Eggleston Grace is a trauma specialist and grief counselor. She has been helping grieving clients for over 20 years and is a certified Rubenfeld Synergist and teaches Somatic Grief Relief. She has supported her clients to navigate through three inevitable facts of grief. One, the ocean of emotion that seemingly comes out of nowhere. Two, recognizing, relating to, and reintegrating the deepest, darkest parts of themselves, longing to be seen, heard, and healed. And finally, answering the question, who am I now that this person, pet, or dream has died? Georgena has helped her clients discover what is keeping them from inner well-being to moving beyond their loss to a life of love. She started the Integrated Wellbeing Institute in 2020 to certify nurses, coaches, and therapists in somatic grief. Georgena Eggleston Grace is the author of a new Mourning, Discovering the Gifts in Grief, and new this year, coming out very soon, Move Beyond Your Grief. Your body knows the way. Let's welcome Georgena here today. Hi, Georgena.
Hello, it's so wonderful to see you, Gail. Thank you for the invitation to be together.
I'm very, very happy to have you here on this wintry, rainy, flooding day in Northern California. And I hope that our show will continue on and we won't lose electricity. But if we do, we'll take care of that if it happens.
Fingers crossed. We'll see what happens.
So before we start into questions about the work that you do, I always like to start sort of with the beginning, which in brief, if you could just tell me, was there things in your life growing up that steered you toward the idea of doing things to help others and to work in fields like that you're in right now? Or was this something that just came to you later in life?
Oh, I was raised, Gail, in a family of kindness and caregivers.
Oh.
My mother was a nurse and my father was a brilliant teacher who later became a salesperson. So they just had a heart for helping, and it was in my DNA.
That's wonderful. So I did not share with our audience how you came to this from the own grieving that you experienced, and I wondered if you wouldn't mind touching upon the losses you experienced that brought you to doing discoveries about grief.
Certainly. In less than 4 years, 5 people in my family died. My brother, Mark, and my father-in-law, Clarence, in June of 1994. And then my mother died of a brain tumor in July of 1997, and my father dropped dead in December of that year from a heart attack. It was the sudden death of my teenage son, Reed, of suicide in January of 1998 that really brought me to my knees. And so my brother Mark died of suicide as well. Mark had a diagnosed mental illness, and a minister in Nebraska had said, if you have enough faith in Jesus, you don't need medication. Mark stopped taking his and he was dead 2 weeks later.
Oh,
So we really had 3 sudden deaths with no goodbye, Mark and my father and Reed. And then we were very fortunate to be able to have the anticipatory grief and the time to say goodbye to Clarence and my mother.
very different
Mhm.
experiences.
Very, very much so. Yeah, yeah.
There's
And yeah,
there's the loss of someone that's already lived out their life. You don't
yes.
really want to let go of them, but you know that it's time to let go.
Mhm.
Very different. It's almost like you get some time to prepare in those situations.
Yes.
But in the other situations of suicide and heart attack, there is no preparation. So how did you handle that then before you found all these other ways to deal with grief?
It was interesting, Gail. There was a part of me that knew I would never grow old with my brother, Mark. He was 5 years younger than I. And at the time of his death, he was 39 and I was 44. And so when we got the call, Mark's dead, of course, my heart stopped. But there was some part of me that knew that things were going to be okay. And in fact, I had my first experience as a medium at 2 weeks after Mark died. I was out sitting in the sun as I would for 20 minutes every afternoon. And I went to my meditation meadow, and here came Mark walking across the meadow. And he was whole and perfect and complete and smiling. And he said, "Tell everybody I'm okay." And so with Mark, there was that awareness that he was okay and that he was no longer in the excruciating pain of his mental illness because he had been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. It was hard. And so, that was my experience with Mark. With my experience with my dad, it was okay. Dad and mother are back together again. They'd been married for 51 years. They met in Tokyo, Japan, right after the occupation. He was on MacArthur's staff as a captain, and mother was an Army nurse. And it was love at first sight. So they were back together again. It was Reed's death that was so very, very, very difficult because as a parent, your responsibility is to raise your children to adulthood. And in a way, I felt I'd failed. And yet, from the very beginning, we had signs that after the first 30 days of Reed's departure, we had this amazing sunset, believe it or not, with his name in the clouds. There was a big R-E-E and finally the gigantic D. And it was like, okay, Reed's okay. And, God's got him decorating heaven. But that still didn't take away my grief. It was like, oh, wow.
I consider that, and I've had quite a few guests, and I've experienced my father-in-law committed suicide. I've experienced some forms of this, that the closest being my father-in-law. And at the time I was doing a Ram Dass retreat.
Oh,
It was on this, I'm not sure if it was the spiritual care of the dying, I'm not exactly sure, but it was in that retreat that I got information that I really understood from Ram Dass's words, which was that you don't know the pain that the person is in who decides to take their life, and that we should be compassionate and not judgmental. Because up until then, I was sort of a little bit judgmental about suicide, because my father used to say, oh, people who pick suicide, that's the wrong thing to do. They're going to be punished in their, next afterlife, or whatever different things I heard. We're always judgmental about suicide. But in this retreat, It was honoring the person that decided that they would take their life and letting them be how that was what they decided to do, and giving them understanding and compassion. And up until that, I really was more of a judgmental, like, oh no, they shouldn't do that, or they could have been helped. Or if that had been a child or a person of mine, the guilt would have made me want to take my own life, I think. I mean, that's how intense I think the loss of a child is, whether it's suicide or accident or however you lose the child. It's not the normal order of things.
No.
You're the parent, you're supposed to take them, like you say, through this.
Mhm.
But I learned in Mark Ireland's case how his child became his teacher and has led him down amazing growth and paths. So now what happened with you and Reed as you started to know he was fine and he was safe? Did his spirit also stay with you?
Oh, absolutely. And that was much of the subject of the first book, A New Mourning, Discovering the Gifts in Grief, because there were so many signs. And what I know is that when something like this happens to us, we're broken open like a seed, but we have the opportunity to grow in self-awareness and new connections. And there's a wonderful neuroscientist out there, Andrew Huberman, who says the task of the grieving is to create those new connections. And then Robert Niemeyer, an esteemed grief counselor, has also said, yes, it's our job to make new meaning. And so Reed and I, he informs my work. And it was really interesting this morning because I was over at my prayer tree at the river, gazing at the sun, which sets my brain and makes it much more attuned for the day. And all of a sudden, I looked up and there was a jet at a very, and that contrail caught my eye. And that's one of the signs from Reed. And so it was like, oh, Mom, you and Gail are going to have such a good time today. And I'm going to be right there.
Well, I'm glad that he's here with us.
Mhm.
And I'm glad that you and like myself respect these signs that I believe come to us. Like for me, my father comes in the form of a hawk. And whenever I felt that I needed to feel his presence or something, I'll go out to I'm on 15 acres in an orchard, and I go out and I look up at the sky and I say, Dad, I need you right now. And a hawk will come out of nowhere. And other people, it could be a hummingbird, it could be a goose, it could be a rabbit. It's hard to say, but it can be a cloud or a plant. But there is this comforted feeling that comes through these signs, and listeners should know, take heed to those signs, welcome them. It's a wonderful thing. Some people think those are silly things. I don't think those are silly things. I think those are real.
I do too. Love never dies. It certainly changes form. And that's exactly what these signs are for all of us.
Well, before I go to all my questions, I have to share something with you because I feel like it's okay. We're not formal here. I had a guest a couple shows ago named Whitney McNeil, and she made one of these Oracle card decks.
Yes.
And I really enjoyed her very much. And I ordered the deck, and I found it to really be, it's not a tarot card. It's just sort of reading about the Oracle. And I decided I've never done this before. Before all my shows, I light sage, which I grew myself and made into sage bundles. And then I always play my Mongolian jaw harp. And before I play it, while I'm playing it, I say the name of my guest. So before you came on, I'm doing Georgena Eggleston, and I'm doing this. But now I'm adding this new thing of pulling a card out about our today's show. And I'm just going to show you the card because, there's 52 cards here to pull from. And this is the one that came up. I won't go into detail, but I'll just read the bottom of the card. But this is what the card that came. Ascended Masters. And I can't read reverse, so I'll have to read it and turn it around. But you're ascending towards your higher calling. The energy is intense. So that was the card for our little get together today. And I thought this might be a new fun thing just to add into my show. So I'd like to start off with my first group of questions. And they're really for our audience to understand. First of all, can you tell us about the integrated, oh wait, no. Yes, can you tell us about the Integrated Wellbeing Institute and how that became?
Certainly, Gail. So I had been doing this grief work with people individually for many years.
Mhm.
All right, since 2000. And in 2020, it became apparent that there was something unique, and it was finally mainstream to talk about the body-mind connection.
Right.
And that's what this work is all about. So in 2020, I had someone that said, you know, I'd really like to know more about this. And so I gathered all the tools and all the stories and ended up certifying 2 people as Somatic Grief Relief practitioners. And that's how we got started. And the reason is that grief lives in the body. We can't think our way through it.
Mhm.
And so the Institute allows people, practitioners, over a 12-week period of time to come into deeper alignment themselves with their intuition, that well-being within, so that they can integrate the things that they've learned as nurses, coaches, and therapists with these new processes and become more deeply present and leave vitalized after in vitality after a session instead of drained. This grief stuff can get really hard.
I've been drained a lot too.
So that's how it all came about. It was the next right answer. Just like your cards, it indicates to me, we're in this quantum flow. And when we listen, things just keep unfolding and expanding. And that's how the Institute came about.
That's wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. So there is a place where people can go to expand their information and work with their clients by going through this, which would then bring me to my next question, which is, what is Rubenfeld's synergy method? Or yes.
Yes. I'm so glad
I've
you
never
asked.
heard of that. And I was watching it on the videos, but I wanted you to share about this with the audience, please.
Oh, it's amazing. So the Institute uses 3 different modalities that then have been synergized over the years. And one is clean language, one is my training as a spiritual practitioner, and then there is Rubenfeld Synergy. Well, it's very interesting. Rubenfeld Synergy was created by Alana Rubenfeld back in the 60s. And Alana was at Juilliard School of Music, becoming a conductor. And as she got ready for her very first performance, she got terrible back spasms. Well, that's not a very good thing to have a conductor experience.
No.
So she trotted off to a practitioner, Judith Leibowitz, and Alana experienced the Alexander method. And it was so interesting because Judith had her lie down on a padded table. She put her hands on Alana's head, and the minute she touched Alana's head, Alana started to cry. And she had no idea where this came from. And so after she got done crying, Judith said, now just relax a little. And Alana said, I am relaxed. Realized she didn't have a clue about her awareness of her body. So one thing led to another. Alana became an Alexander teacher. She continued to conduct. She took training with Moshe Feldenkrais to become a Feldenkrais practitioner. And then she studied with Fritz and Laura Perls at Esalen. And so she took all of these things and put them together. And the crowning jewel of the whole thing, when she finally got ready, Fritz called her up into the circle where he was with somebody in the hot seat. And he said, Alana, come up here and do that touch thing. So she started touching people's bodies and feeling the emotions that were there. So what Rubenfeld Synergy is, it is a way to listen with your whole body using talk and touch, curiosity and humor, and metaphor. And what it teaches people is it teaches people the language of the metaphor of the body. First, it teaches people to listen deeply to themselves. Because how often in time do we just go running along, not giving a thought to what's happening? We're on automatic pilot. But what this method does is it slows people down to listen inside, to then access the images, the messages, and the metaphors of their body. It's profound.
I want to say that for me, in all the different things I've experienced in my life, that body work was the best therapy I'd ever had of any of the talkings or any of the different kinds or any of the retreats. And I had no idea the different things and memories that were locked inside my body until I committed to doing deep body work. And the release from pains and grieving and things like this was very powerful. Nothing ever gets diminished to me in my body of traumas of the past. They don't disappear forever or anything like this. No, nothing I've ever done has eliminated it all for some reason, but put it in a place of understanding and having compassion for the person or the Gail that went through those different things.
Exactly.
And I've always told people, try body work, because the body is holding, every cell is holding all of those memories. And I don't think, I mean, it may just be a saying, but I don't think we're given more than we can actually handle when we do those things. The things that come up for us to look at are things that we need to take a look at, and we're ready to do that when they surface.
I agree 100% that it's a challenge at the time. And when we're ready to look at it, it becomes our teacher. And then it's like, okay, now, how do I integrate this so that I can come from that place of compassion and love for myself and then be that in the world?
You know, being the sort of psychic sponge that I am, and I don't ask to be this way, it just happens. What I experience at funerals or memorials or in any of these death situations, because I've always had a very close connection with death and knowing things about death, is that a lot of people do not let out their grief. And when you go to this, when I was at my father-in-law's funeral, there was not one person with a crying eye. And I wasn't sure if it was because they were all Episcopalians or maybe there's no crying in here. I mean, I didn't know, but I had to be carried out because of the amount of emotion that was coming through me. And I knew that it wasn't just my loss of my father-in-law having committed suicide. It was all those people in the room who were not shedding a tear or connecting to any of that, like they were all stone. And it's not that they don't have the feelings. They just don't seem to didn't know how to access, or their mind keeps it squashed. I'm not sure what goes on, because in those situations, all I can think about is grieving and crying. So how do these people hold themselves together like that?
Well, it's really interesting. I'm so glad we're talking about this because at my brother's funeral, of course, there was no crying. And at my son's funeral, of course, there was crying, but it was years, there were 4 years, almost 4 years difference. What I realized, though, at my son's funeral, there should have been wailing instead of crying. And I've always admired this woman, and so I don't want anyone that hears the words that are going to come out of my mouth now to feel that this is a criticism. I believe that when Jackie Kennedy was able to stand there in her grief, in that state of elegance and holding it together the way she did, it set her precedent.
Oh, interesting.
And I remember at my son's funeral coming up the aisle, and I've never told anyone this before, but I looked over at a woman who was a member of our business family. We had a rehab agency, and she was one of the speech pathologists that was in the agency. And I looked at Michelle and I smiled. Now, who would smile at their son's funeral? I was on that automatic. It was like the grief in me was so deep. Yes, I'd already wailed, but there was something that was holding me up and keeping me together. And when the Georgena, who's that joyous Georgena, saw somebody in such deep pain, I smiled at her. And it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. And recently, here we are trained to take very good care of our energy. And that's what I'm training people to do in this program, which is, by the way, an online program where we teach people self-touch. We work with clients remotely so they can touch themselves and find out what's happening in their body. They're doing their own body work.
That's great.
I went to see my massage therapist and I said, so what are you noticing in my body? She says, Georgena, now this was in December, so we know how intense things are. She said, in this moment, your body feels like a tea bag full of cream and it's not yours. And I said, well, I guess I better get to work and do a little bit more self-awareness and stop soaking up everybody else's grief.
Oh, very good way to say it. Soaking, it's like my sponge.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And what I really often teach people to do who are in the office in the position that you and I are, because so many people are sensitives and empathetics, I'll just say, okay, imagine a colander in your heart and the energy comes in and the energy goes out all the little holes in the back. And then we decide what the size of the colander is going to look like, if it's a heart shape or if it's this big or if it's this big. And so anyway, it's time for me to go back to the basics, I think, Gail.
I find this very interesting. I think you'll be my 38th show. And almost in every single show, my guests share something they've never shared before. And so this makes me feel like I'm on the right path every time it keeps happening, because all I want to do here, my only goal for this show, is to share healing stories in hopes that anyone listening to it will either go and contact the guest or will grow from what they've heard, or something will spark something in them. And so I just want to thank you for supporting that idea of mine without even knowing.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Well, and one of the healing things I want to share right now is that in order to shatter the stigma of suicide, one of the things we're doing is relanguaging how we speak about it. So now we say people died of suicide. People die of cancer, people die of heart disease. So we say now people die of suicide. So that's one of the healings, because there's so much stigma around suicide, as you know, and I do too.
Yes, yes. And I find I have a friend who lost both her husband and her daughter to suicide, and she has grown so amazingly as a being, and she's such an inspiration. And she goes around and speaks with other people and brings comfort to others. And so all of these things are, if we're just looking at it like we're on a ride, it's taking them to other places that are very beautiful. And it's hard to think of it that way when you think of, such a loss and the shock of that. So you do speak about something that you call, and I thought we could go over each one now, if you don't mind. We have plenty of time, which is the 6 deadly Ds. And I thought that very fascinating. And we can talk about them. And one of them, the first one you had, I'd like to speak about all 6, because you do also speak about, that a loss could not necessarily be a body. It might be loss of a job or a relationship or all these other things. And the grief you're experiencing can be almost as deep as the loss of a human being or an animal. And one of the questions I have around this, so this is a double one, you've got to tell us about the 6 deadly Ds, but I wanted to start with disaster as our first D, because I'm wondering what you're experiencing as a therapist with, like, I have a dear friend whose husband passed away in the height of COVID. And he died alone in a hospital bed because it was at the point where no one could go in and nobody, and everybody was, and he was in there. And he's not the only one. There's some other friends that I know who've lost someone, but how you lose someone where you didn't get to be with, I mean, this is an unusual kind. This isn't deaths like we're not used to the hospital saying, no, you can't come in here. You can't see this person. They're here for a month and we can't send them home. How do you deal with this? Because to me, that's very overwhelming. I feel so for all these people and friends and family who've lost someone and not been able to touch and hold them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Just recently, I was with a client who was not able to be there when their spouse died. So what we did is we rescripted that. So we went from that state of alertness to the state of deep relaxation to a state of even deeper relaxation. So we were in that theta brainwave. And my voice can be kind of trancy and lull people. And so what we did is we reprogrammed the death in present time, because when we're working, we're always in present time, and that's the only place the change can happen. Mm-hmm. And what we did is they were together. They were present together. And as I took this person through that, I said, okay, now it's time for them to leave. And what would you say? Where would you be? In, holding their hand, in the bed with them, whatever it was. And so it was a profound experience. And I would invite anyone that's listening and in that state of deep grief because they weren't present to either do this themselves, because so many of your listeners are so attuned to this kind of thing, or to come and be with a trusted friend where they can together, because they both knew this beloved person, have that dialogue.
That's a wonderful thing to share with the audience. And I truly hope that some of the people do try that. In fact, now that you're saying it, I'm going to call up my girlfriend who lost her husband and ask her if she'd like to come up and us do that togetger. And I really wasn't sure how to approach that. And now you've given me a great way to try to do that with a person, because you feel like you want to help, but you don't know how in that way.
Right. And what grieving people want and need the most is powerful presence. Well, you've gotten spades, Gail. And everyone does when they get the fear out of the way.
Mhm.
And so when people realize with grief, there's nothing to fix, it's a process. And the grieving person simply needs your presence. That, and how I was saying with the dialoguing, then it's an opportunity for the two of you to create something beautiful. And because you're doing it in the present moment, it's truly a creation.
Very beautifully said. Thank you.
Welcome.
So tell us about the deadly D's.
Okay. Well, these came about, Gail, simply because people are in grief so often, but they don't recognize it. It's like, what's wrong with me? My energy is off. I'm in a high state of stress. There's nothing wrong with you. You're grieving. You're grieving because you've just gone through a natural disaster, a flood, a fire, a hurricane, a tornado, an earthquake. Yesterday, I was on the phone with someone and we were talking, who lives in Chico now. And so many of the people from Paradise have moved to that part of California. And it will be 5 years this fall that the fire occurred, if my math is correct, because it was in November of 18 and it's 23. That says 5 years to me. So we were talking about what to create as a grief process and more healing on the deathversary of this tragedy. So that came as a result of a fire, that natural disaster. 85 people died in their cars trying to get away. And then another one of the 6 deadly Ds is that destruction, which happens with bullying, with physical, emotional abuse, sexual abuse specifically, with murder and war, all of that. But it's very interesting. I have a client now in their 60s who we are contacting those wounds from being bullied. And how does that inform that person to be with others today? And so we're soaking that, moving that out of their body so the confidence can come in, because nature abhors a vacuum. And so that's what we want to see happen. So then there's the despair of waking up day after day, like so many people did in the pandemic. And it's, what do I look forward to? Where am I at? And then divorce. So now we're in the 3 big Ds here of divorce and diagnosis. And in our culture, when we get a diagnosis, so many times we just go right to, okay, how are we going to treat this? Instead of stopping to grieve what's happened in your body, to talk to your body and say, wow, how did this happen to us? What are you feeling? I'm terrified. You're going to die on me. And to be able to be then in that place of deep connection. So that diagnosis, we were talking earlier about just being on automatic pilot. Heck, I was at Reed's funeral with that smile. But for us to slow down and really connect when we've got that diagnosis. One of the things I want to go back to in the despair is moving. So many people don't realize that when they move, they've lost the familiar home. Oh, yes, they might be moving to a gorgeous home on the coast, but they're still leaving their friends, perhaps their family, a job, retiring. It's big. It's time to stop and really check in. What am I feeling? Am I feeling safe? What do I need to have happen here? And then we've got the, so divorce is another one that so often people it depends on which side of the divorce you're on. I have a friend whose first divorce was, oh, I'm getting divorced. And the second divorce was, she felt like she'd been run over by a truck. So again, we have to tune in to divorce and what that has to bring. And it's interesting, Gail, because every single loss brings with it a different kind of grief. So the last one, the death of a person, of a pet, of a dream. Oh, I thought I would do this. And people need to really honor, okay, it didn't happen. How many times did I fall down when I was trying to learn to walk? This really isn't a failure. It's just not happened. But it's still causing me grief. So does that answer your question about the 6 deadly?
Yes. And it also shows our listeners that we may have grieving in our body that doesn't necessarily have to do with a physical death of a person. It may have to do with other things that is really, we do grieve. And I know in divorce, there can also be the grieving of the loss of the dream of what you thought the two of, so it's like combination.
Yes.
Of what you thought the two of you were going to have together, and the dream you thought would occur, and you find yourself in this other place. So I'm glad that the listeners know we're not just talking about physical bodily death here. The body gets affected by other types of trauma as well. And in fact, this is where I think I'm going to share my one little story, because I always like to share one story. And this happened in September. And this is what I want to share about, is that some people make fun of other people when they grieve the loss of a pet. And they think it's just an animal, or it's just a bird, or it's just a something. And it isn't. It's a family member. And some people just, if they've never had that kind of deep connection, or they can just lose an animal and not feel that much about it or whatever, I don't know. But for me, losing a pet has always been like I've lost somebody who was part of my home. They protected me, they cared for me, I cared for them. So what that they're an animal? The loss is still very sad. And in this one I want to share is that I was going to hold up a picture here. Well, I left it in the other room, but anyways, on the day that we lost Queen Elizabeth, I went outside and there was my little long-haired Chihuahua, Rocky, who's 14 years old, and he had been going through all kinds of bodily aging things, like he lost his eyesight and his hearing and his senses were going. And so we were pretty much, he slept in my bed. I happily carried him inside out of the house or whatever to go to the bathroom. So I bring him outside and the sun is shining, and I put him down on the grass and I look at him and I say, "What a good boy you are, Rocky." I didn't know that that was going to be the last words I ever said to him. I walked over to my tomato garden, to where my tomatoes are growing, where I thought I only had a couple of tomatoes to pick, and I'd go right back in the house. But instead, there was like 2 or 3 boxes of tomatoes out there. So it took me more like 45 minutes to pick all these tomatoes. So I pick all the tomatoes and I carry the box in. And when I go back in the house, I look around the house and I tell my son and husband, "Where's Rocky? Didn't he come back in?" And they say, "No, he must be somewhere." And I just looked at them with this known certainty. I said, "He's gone. Something happened and he's gone." And I started panicking and getting frantic. And they thought I was being silly, that, he's probably just over here or over there. And after an hour of looking everywhere, there is no trace of Rocky, no hair, no fur, nothing. He has just disappeared out of thin air. And it's not like, I'm living in nature. I'm not living, in the city or something. And I was so distraught and I was so crying, and I had such guilt that I put him outside for that particular moment, that if I had done it at a different moment, would he still be here? And where did he go? And there was this worse feeling than I'd ever had, because most of my dogs have always died in my arms. And I've been very fortunate to either hold them and learn from them or care for them beyond what the vet says they're going to die today, but they live another 10 days, because I'm so attached and connected with them. And I've had many dogs, and they've lasted always more than the amount of years that they say. A little dog like this can last a lot longer than 14 years, these little ones. And he's only 6 pounds. So I can't come up with an idea of what did, because we didn't hear a sound, nothing, but where could he go in broad daylight? So then we figured maybe it was my father, the hawk, and he had come down and picked him up and swooped him away because he was needing a lot of care with his eyes and his glaucoma and his other things. And I was going in for eye surgery in a few days. And I felt like he had taken, I have glaucoma, so I felt like he took my glaucoma into him. And I was feeling so like, what has happened to this guy? So for 10 days, every day I'm crying, but I feel incomplete because I don't have a body. I don't have something to say. Here he was, he lived here, he died here. And everybody's buried here. I have a pet cemetery in the back from everybody else's dogs and mine. On the 10th day, and I still hadn't given up. Sometimes my daughter would say, maybe he just got lost and all of a sudden he's going to walk back in, And my niece's husband is visiting for the afternoon with his son. And on the 15 acres, we have an area where there's a pond, and it's way back in a, area with a lot of bushes and everything. So the son is playing like a hide and go seeky thing, and the father's trying to find him. And instead of finding the son back at the other end of my property, in the middle of nowhere where he's looking, he sees the skull and bones of my dog. And he comes up to the house, and he says, I don't know how to tell this to you, because he feels like bad about saying he found the bones. I went into joyous relief. I was so happy to know that he was there. And we went down, and my niece was there with her kids, and my son was here. My whole family just happened to be here at that moment. And I went down there and I gathered up his body piece by piece. And it was such a kind of shamanic combination. And being a Mongolian initiated shaman myself, there was something that it put me into a place of really connection and knowing what to do. And I gathered everything, and I put him all in a box, and I played my jaw harp, and I did smudging all around him. Everybody dug a little hole was dug for him, and each one of us put dirt on top of him and said goodbye in a very proper way. It was deeply emotional for me doing it, but it was combined with complete relief that now I've completed this relationship and we are completed. But until then, I felt really upset with myself because I felt like I had personally lost him by taking him out to pee that day. My niece's little guy, Adam, he's a very sensitive boy, and I think maybe he was 7, he's maybe 7 at the time in September. And he wanted to throw the dirt on, and he watched every part of the ceremony and what his Auntie Gail was doing in such a beautiful learning, teaching way that the whole experience I felt was good for all. And we thanked Rocky, and I'd had an altar and candle going for him, but now I finally felt complete. And some may say, oh, it was just a dog or whatever, but it was somebody who was there with me for 14 years of your life, and they're part of your family. And I just want to honor anyone who feels their loss of a pet in a very deep way, that's a fine thing to feel, and there's nothing wrong with you.
Absolutely. And besides that, I bet Rocky never criticized you once.
No. And in
Yeah.
fact, I feel his presence all the time here. So I don't even feel like he left the property.
Yes. And that's the thing, is they are the ones, these 4-leggeds, that love us unconditionally.
Yes.
And that's why their loss is so deep. There are many people that have contacted me because their four-legged has died, and it is their child.
This is very true. And other people should honor that part of them because it's very real.
That's right. Otherwise, it's minimizing the loss. And in a way, that's very traumatizing. It's dismissive. It's disrespectful.
So any of your listeners out there, if you have a friend or family member or your own who loses a pet or animal, know how to be kind. Send them a card. Let them know you can feel for them for their loss. So I want to go getting down toward the end of our talk here now. I want to find out about your new book, when it's coming out and what it's about, and any tidbits you'd like to share.
Oh, certainly. Thank you so much.
Oh, and
Well,
by the way, if you could open with the title of your book, and for our listeners, all of Georgena's contacts will be in our description. You'll know about where to get her books and where to contact her and what things are on her websites. So we'll have that for you at the end. But let us hear now about this.
all right. Well, thank you so much. The new book is Move Beyond Deep Grief. Your Body Knows the Way. And what it is it introduces people to the new paradigm of grief. You're not broken by this loss. You're broken open like a seed to grow in new awareness of yourself and to create new connections with that one that has departed. And what I know is that my journey through grief has certainly been ups and downs, like every single person. Grief never goes away, it becomes different. But grief happens to all of us when we have a significant loss. And for years and years, I was asking, why do we have to have this? And yet it's like, Georgena, look at nature. It's cyclical. There is birth and there is death. So this book provides for the people who are being certified a deeper guide. And it also then is a book that they will use with their grieving clients so that people can discern where grief lives in their body, to listen deeply to its messages, and most of all, its metaphors. And yesterday it was so neat because my client with whom I had worked now, this was our 5th session together online, and their life emotion is anxiety. And so for this particular person, the anxiety increased when their spouse passed away. And so what we've always done is go into their stomach because that's where the anxiety lives. But this time when I said, I invite you to scan your body and notice any ache or pain or sensation, they said, you know, since my partner died, I've experienced this pain in my left shoulder. And I had everything to do, Gail, to stay present because that's my grief shoulder. So I told them the story of being at the cemetery on my son, what would have been his 16th birthday, and cleaning up the candles from the kid's birthday party the night before and feeling like a saber-toothed tiger grab my shoulder. And so when I started the Rubenfeld Synergy training in November, just months later, it happened again. So we went to a faculty member and said, what is this about? And they said, oh, this is the back of your heart. This is where your grief is living. Well, of course it would. And so with my client yesterday, then I was able to say, and so what are you shouldering now? And we explored that metaphor. So that's what this book is all about. It's an opportunity for people to be able to regulate their emotions with many different processes to become very aware and connected to that well-being within by setting an intention, by increasing their intuition and integrating that part of themselves that thinks but doesn't know, and that part of themselves that knows but doesn't think. And that's what this conversation has been today. So much knowing without thinking. It's just come from our hearts. So that's what this book is all about. It's saying there's nothing wrong with you, you're grieving, that this is a process. And it answers the question, who am I now? By allowing then the reader to discern what intention they'll set for themselves, how to strengthen their intuition, and then to integrate that at the level of their body and their mind.
That's beautiful. So for our listeners, when do you think this will be, and will this be something they can find on Amazon, or when will this be released?
This will be released probably late spring, but for sure by July 27th, which will be Reed's birthday. And he'd be 41 this year.
Wow.
And so look for it. So if you're really interested in following, just send me a little email. I'll put you on a list. And when the book comes out, I'll send you the link to where you can find it. That would be very generous of your listeners to do.
Wonderful. So I want to say that I really enjoyed having you here today. And I really like the subjects that we're talking about. And notice, listeners, any of you who watch us on YouTube that see our faces, if you could see the huge smile for the ones who don't have us on video, Georgena has a smile that I think could light up a room, a world, a place. So I know you're doing great, great work, and it really emanates from you. And I wish I could have a smile that big and that beautiful. I have a laugh, but I don't have a smile like that. That's an incredible smile. And if there's any little last words of wisdom or anything you would like to leave our listeners with.
Listen deeply to yourselves, because every single person who comes and sits with me and I sit with them has the wisdom within. All I do is listen. So listen deeply and trust yourself and invite that knowing part of yourself that doesn't think to be your guide, your well-being.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. And I want to thank our listeners today for joining us at A Small, Medium, at Large podcast. You know that you can find us on YouTube, where we have over 1,000 subscribers now. We are on Spotify, Apple and Google podcasts, and all other podcast platforms. I want to say thank you again and again and again to all these people that come on our show. That is has its own organic flow. I never know who the guest is going to be, and they just appear, and it turns out they knew the last guest I just had. So I feel like it's a very small world. So have a great, great couple of weeks till we see you again. And remember to share your stories, because you know stories can heal. Bye.